A rancher's dog found a dying girl in the dust, until he knew she was his promised bride. Hank Carter had been riding across the dusty land for hours, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the vast open range. His horse moved steadily, its hooves kicking up small clouds of dirt as they made their way to the farthest corner of his ranch. It was the kind of evening where the wind carried a soft, dry scent from the desert, and the only sound besides his horse's steady gait was the distant call of a coyote. Hank, a man of few words, often found peace in these moments of solitude, but today was different. Today he felt uneasy, as if something was off in the air. The ranch had been quiet for days, and though that was usually a good thing, the stillness had begun to wear on him. There were no signs of trouble from the cattle or the workers, and yet Hank couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking, just beyond his reach. As he guided his horse along the fence line, Hank's dog Buck trotted beside him, his ears alert and his nose twitching. Buck was a loyal dog, trained to watch over the ranch and keep the land safe from any intruders. Hank trusted him like family. When Buck suddenly stopped and growled low in his throat, Hank's attention snapped to the dog, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung over his shoulder. "Buck, what is it, boy?" Hank muttered, his voice rough from years of solitude. The dog's growl deepened, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. Hank narrowed his gaze, trying to see what had caught Buck's attention. There, on the edge of the field, near the dried-up creek bed, he saw it. A figure lying in the dust. It wasn't uncommon to find dead animals out here, but this was different. The figure was too small, too fragile-looking to be an animal. Without thinking, Hank spurred his horse forward, urging the animal into a gallop. As they drew closer, Hank's heart skipped a beat. It was a girl, barely moving, her clothes torn and stained, her face streaked with dirt and blood. She looked like she had been lying there for hours, maybe even longer. Hank's mind raced as he slowed his horse to a stop and dismounted. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears. Buck trotted up to the girl and nudged her gently with his nose, his tail wagging uncertainly. Hank rushed forward, kneeling beside her. His hands shook as he gently lifted her head, feeling the coolness of her skin. She was alive, but just barely. Her breathing was shallow, each gasp for air coming in quick, desperate bursts. "What happened to you?" Hank muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, barely focused, and she tried to speak, but the words came out in a weak rasp. "Help," she gasped. "Please." Hank's heart ached at the sound of her voice. He could see that she was in bad shape. Her face was bruised, her lips cracked, and her clothes were covered in dust and dirt, as though she had been dragged through the desert. He gently brushed a lock of hair from her face, his rough fingers lingering on her skin. She shivered under his touch, her body too weak to respond. "Don't worry, I'm going to get you help," Hank said, his voice firm. He looked around, scanning the vast emptiness of the land. They were miles from town, and the nearest neighbor was a good ride away. There was no one to help out here, and the girl was too far gone to wait for help. Hank's mind raced as he quickly made a decision. He had to get her back to his cabin, to his ranch. It was the only place he could help her. Without another thought, he lifted her gently into his arms, cradling her like a child. She was light, fragile in his embrace, and he couldn't help but wonder how she had ended up here, all alone in the middle of nowhere. He mounted his horse with the girl in his arms, carefully positioning her so she was held securely against his chest. Buck, ever loyal, trotted ahead, his nose to the ground as if leading the way. The ride back was long and slow, with Hank keeping his eyes focused on the road ahead and his mind fixed on the girl. She was quiet, her body pressed against him, but every now and then she would shudder, her breath hitching as if in pain. When they finally arrived at Hank's cabin, the sun had set, leaving a dark sky overhead. Hank carried the girl inside, where the warmth of the fire greeted them. He laid her down gently on the cot by the hearth, where she would be able to rest and recover. Buck lay down at her feet, keeping a watchful eye on her. Hank had seen the bond between animals and humans before, but it was rare for a dog to be so protective of someone it didn't know. Something about this girl seemed to call to Buck, and Hank couldn't help but feel the same way. As he gathered supplies to tend to her wounds, Hank couldn't help but wonder about the girl's story. Who was she? How had she ended up out here, alone in the desert? She couldn't have walked all that way by herself. There had to be more to this than what he could see. The girl's condition worsened overnight. By morning she had a fever, her body trembling beneath the thin blanket Hank had draped over her. He did what he could to ease her discomfort, bringing her water and cooling her forehead with a damp cloth. But she remained mostly unconscious, her breathing ragged and shallow. It wasn't until the second day that she began to stir. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment she looked confused, as if unsure of where she was. Hank was sitting by the fire sharpening his knife when he noticed her movements. "Hey," he said gently, standing up and walking over to her. "You're safe now." The girl's eyes focused on him for a moment, and she opened her mouth as if to speak, but only a faint whisper escaped. Who are you?" Hank's heart skipped a beat. He had expected the question, but hearing it aloud made the situation all the more real. "My name's Hank Carter," he said softly. "You are on my ranch. I found you out there in the dust." She looked around, her eyes taking in her surroundings. The cabin was small but cozy, a far cry from the desolate desert she must have come from. I don't remember." Her voice trailed off, and she seemed to drift back into unconsciousness. Hank sat by her side, his hand resting on her forehead. He didn't know what had brought this girl to his doorstep, but he knew one thing for certain. He was going to help her. He had no idea what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, Hank Carter felt like there was more to his life than the quiet ranch he had known for so many years. The days after Clara's arrival at the ranch passed slowly. She was still weak, but every day she seemed to grow a little stronger. Hank took care of her the best he could, but the silence between them grew heavy. He didn't want to push her, but there were so many questions he needed answered. Why had she been out there in the desert all alone? And what was her story? Clara, still confused and disoriented, spent most of her time lying on the cot by the fire, staring at the ceiling as if trying to remember something important. Hank kept his distance, understanding that she wasn't ready to talk, but he couldn't help but wonder about her past. The only thing she ever said clearly, aside from her initial plea for help, was that she was supposed to marry someone. Words kept echoing in Hank's mind. I was supposed to marry someone. One afternoon, Clara stirred awake earlier than usual. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden light through the small window of the cabin. Hank was sitting by the fire cleaning his gear, as he often did when he had time to think. He looked up when he heard Clara's soft cough, a sign she was waking. "Feeling better today?" Hank asked gently, walking over to her. He had noticed her looking more alert in recent days, but today there was something different. She seemed more aware. She turned her head toward him, her eyes focused, though she still looked fragile. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice still weak, but clearer than before. Hank paused, considering his words. "You're on my ranch, Clara."
"I found you out in the desert. You've been through a lot."
She blinked slowly, as though trying to make sense of what he said. "The desert," her voice trailed off, and she seemed lost in thought for a moment. Hank sat down on the edge of the cot, careful not to make her uncomfortable. He didn't want to crowd her, but he needed to know what happened. "Do you remember what happened out there?" he asked softly. Clara hesitated, as though trying to piece together the broken fragments of her memories. Her brow furrowed, and she shook her head slightly. I remember walking. I remember feeling so tired, so thirsty, but nothing else. It's like everything else is just a blur." Hank nodded, trying to make sense of it. He couldn't imagine what she had been through. The heat of the desert could drive anyone to madness, and her memory loss seemed to be a result of the trauma she'd endured. But Hank had the feeling there was more to her story than what she was willing to share. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know how I ended up there. My family, they were Her words faltered, and Hank saw the confusion in her eyes. Whatever had happened to her, it was clear it was more than just a simple accident. He placed a hand gently on her arm, offering reassurance. "You don't have to talk about it yet," Hank said, his voice soft and steady. "You're safe here. We'll take things one step at a time." Clara looked at him, and for the first time there was a hint of recognition in her eyes. Something about his presence seemed familiar, as though she knew she could trust him. Her eyes fluttered, and she closed them for a moment, taking a deep breath. "Thank you," she whispered, "for helping me." Hank smiled slightly, but there was a sadness in his eyes that Clara didn't fully understand. "It's the least I could do. You're safe now." The days continued to pass, and Clara grew stronger. She was able to sit up for longer periods of time, and Hank even caught her gazing out of the cabin window, her eyes scanning the horizon as if waiting for something, or someone, to appear. Hank knew that once she was strong enough, she would need to return to her life, wherever that was. But for now, he couldn't push her too hard. He gave her the space she needed, hoping that one day she would remember everything. One morning as the sun rose higher, Clara sat by the fire, a mug of tea in her hands, looking more like her old self than ever. Hank had been outside working, mending a fence, and when he returned to the cabin, he found her sitting in the same spot. "How are you feeling today?" Hank asked, his tone light. Clara looked up at him, her face thoughtful. "Better. I think my head's clearer. The fog in my mind is lifting little by little." Hank nodded, relieved. "That's good to hear." They fell into a quiet rhythm, a routine that seemed to grow between them with every passing day. As Clara regained more strength, Hank began teaching her small tasks around the ranch, like mending fences and feeding the animals. She was a quick learner, and soon she was helping with chores in the morning and evening. It gave her a sense of purpose, something to focus on while she tried to remember the life she had lost. Still, there were moments of silence, moments when Clara would look off into the distance, her eyes lost in thought. Hank knew she was still searching for the truth of her past, and though he didn't push her to share anything she wasn't ready to, he couldn't help but wonder about her story. He noticed that when she was alone, she often whispered to herself, as if trying to recall something. It was as though she was waiting for a memory to return, a memory that would explain why she had ended up here. One evening after a long day of work, Hank and Clara sat outside on the porch, watching the sunset. The orange and pink hues painted the sky, and a gentle breeze rustled the tall grasses surrounding the ranch. It was a peaceful moment, and for the first time since she had arrived, Clara seemed to relax fully. "I've been thinking," Clara said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "about what you said when I first woke up. You said I was supposed to marry someone. Do you know who that was?"
Hank felt a chill run down his spine.
He had hoped she wouldn't remember so soon, but the question was there, hanging in the air. He had tried to bury the memory of that promise, but now it was unavoidable. "I think," Hank began, his voice low, "I think you were promised to me," her eyes wide with surprise. "What do you mean?" she asked, confusion evident in her voice. Hank sighed, feeling the weight of the words. "My father arranged the marriage. He made a deal with your family years ago. It was supposed to be a way to unite our ranches, but I never agreed to it. I didn't know it would involve you." Clara's face flushed with emotion. "So, you're telling me that I was promised to a stranger?" Hank could see the hurt in her eyes, and it made his chest tighten. He hadn't meant for this to hurt her, but the truth was unavoidable. "I'm not a stranger to you. We've both been part of this arrangement for a long time, even if we didn't know it." There was a long pause as Clara absorbed his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what to think," she said. "Everything feels like a dream. I don't know who I am, and I don't know who I'm supposed to be. All I know is that I'm here, and I'm alive because of you."
Hank's heart softened, and he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder.
"You don't have to have all the answers right now. You're safe here, Clara. Whatever happens next, we'll figure it out together." Clara nodded slowly, though she still seemed unsure of her place in the world. But for now, she allowed herself to be here, in this moment, with Hank, and that was enough. Whatever her future held, she was grateful to be alive, and she was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, her future was here, on this ranch, with the man who had saved her life. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Clara grew stronger. Her memories remained clouded, but she started to feel like herself again, even if the pieces of her past were still scattered just out of reach. Hank, too, had grown accustomed to her presence. There was a certain quiet peace between them now. They worked together on the ranch, taking care of the cattle, mending fences, and tending to the land. They fell into a steady routine, and for the first time in a long while, Hank felt like there was more to life than just work. Clara brought a warmth to the ranch that it had been lacking for years. Yet even as the days passed, there was still something unspoken between them, something that neither of them dared to fully acknowledge. Hank couldn't deny that he was beginning to feel something more for Clara, something that went beyond simply caring for her as a guest in his home. And Clara, though unsure of what she felt, found herself drawn to Hank in a way that was both confusing and comforting. She had never imagined her life would lead her to this ranch, to this man, but somehow it felt like fate. It was one evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day of work, that Clara spoke the words Hank had been dreading. "Hank," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "what did you mean when you said I was promised to you?" He had known this conversation would come sooner or later, but he hadn't been ready for it. He glanced at Clara, who was staring into the flames, her face unreadable. "It's a long story," Hank began, his voice low. "My father arranged the marriage when I was young. He and your family had been friends for years, and they decided it would be best if our ranches joined forces, through me and you. The agreement was made before I even knew you." Clara looked at him, her expression unreadable. "And you never agreed to it?" Hank shook his head. "I didn't know about it until I was older. By then, it was too late. My father had made the arrangements, and it was expected that I would follow through. But I never wanted it. I didn't know you, Clara, and I didn't want my life to be decided for me." Clara felt a sharp pang in her chest at his words. The thought of being promised to someone she had never even met felt strange, even foreign. She had grown up hearing stories of love, of marriage, but never once had she imagined that her own life would be decided by someone else. And now, to hear Hank say that he hadn't wanted it either, made her feel like a pawn in a game she hadn't agreed to play. "I don't understand," she whispered. "If you didn't want it, why did you go along with it?" Hank paused, his eyes distant. "It wasn't really my choice. My father believed it was the best thing for both our families, but I was never given the chance to choose my own path. I just did what I was told, like I always had." Clara felt a mix of sadness and sympathy for Hank. She could see how much the weight of his father's expectations had shaped him. It was clear that Hank had never had the freedom to make his own choices, and that in turn had shaped his view of the world. She understood what it felt like to be trapped by someone else's plans, and in that moment, Clara realized that perhaps she wasn't the only one who had been promised to someone. "I'm sorry," Clara said softly, her voice filled with empathy. "You never had a say in any of this, did you?" Hank met her gaze, his eyes searching hers. "No, I didn't. But that doesn't mean it's what I wanted. I didn't want to be tied to something that wasn't my choice. And I certainly didn't want it to be like this." Clara's heart softened as she listened to him. It wasn't just the pain of the past that he carried, but also the burden of an arranged future that had never been his to decide. She understood now why Hank had been so distant at first. He had carried this heavy weight for years, and only now was he beginning to realize that he didn't have to carry it alone.
"You don't have to follow through with it," Clara said gently, her voice filled with quiet determination.
"You don't have to marry me just because your father said so." Hank looked at her, surprised by the strength in her words. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Clara continued, "that if this is your choice, you don't have to do it. We don't have to follow through with what was promised all those years ago. You can make your own decisions now, just like I'm trying to do." Hank stared at her, his mind spinning. Her words were freeing, a promise of something he had longed for but never dared to hope for. The idea that he could choose for himself, that he could shape his future instead of being bound by promises made long before he had any say in the matter, felt like a weight lifting off his shoulders. But even as the thought began to take root, doubt crept in. "What about you?" Hank asked quietly. "What do you want, Clara?" Clara's heart fluttered at the question. She had asked herself that same thing countless times since arriving at the ranch. She had come here broken, lost and unsure of what her future held. But with each day she had felt herself healing, feeling more like the person she had once been. She had never expected to find peace here, and certainly not with Hank. But the truth was, she had come to care for him in a way she hadn't anticipated. "I don't know," Clara said, her voice filled with honesty. "I don't know what I want yet. But I know that I can't go back to the life I had before. I don't know where my future lies, but I do know that I'm not ready to make decisions based on someone else's plans anymore." The words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Clara felt her heart racing, unsure of what would happen next. But something inside her told her that whatever path they chose, it was theirs to decide. Hank reached out, his hand resting gently on hers. His touch was warm, grounding, and for a brief moment, Clara felt a sense of calm wash over her. They were no longer bound by the promises of the past. They were free to choose their own way forward. "We'll figure it out," Hank said softly, his voice steady. "One step at a time." Clara nodded, feeling a sense of hope begin to bloom in her chest. For the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, she felt like she had a future that was hers to create. And with Hank by her side, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The fire crackled quietly in the background, casting flickering shadows on the walls of the cabin. The night was still, and the stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, as if offering a silent promise that the future was full of possibilities, waiting for them to take the first step. The days that followed the conversation by the fire were filled with change. Hank and Clara both felt a shift between them, something that was hard to define but clear nonetheless. As the ranch work continued, they found themselves not just working together, but sharing small moments, exchanging glances that spoke volumes more than words ever could. Yet, there was still a sense of hesitation between them. They were both trying to figure out what their future would look like, but neither was ready to make any bold decisions. The following week, Hank noticed a change in Clara. She was out of the cabin more often, spending time near the fields, walking the perimeter of the ranch, and quietly observing the cattle. It was as if she was trying to find a sense of belonging, to reconnect with the land that had welcomed her after the long journey through the desert. Hank knew it wasn't just the physical healing that she was after. It was something deeper, something more intangible. She was still trying to make sense of her place in the world. One afternoon, Hank decided to give her some space, knowing that she was wrestling with her thoughts. He spent the day fixing the barn roof, making sure it was secure before the winter storms arrived. As he worked, he couldn't help but think about Clara, about how much she had changed since she arrived at his ranch. The girl who had been weak and fearful now stood strong and determined, no longer the fragile figure he had first found in the desert, but someone who was finding her way. By the time Hank finished his work, the sun was setting, and the sky was a brilliant orange. He made his way back toward the cabin, ready for a quiet evening. As he approached the porch, he saw Clara sitting there, her back straight, staring out over the land. It was a peaceful sight, one that made Hank's chest tighten slightly. There was something about the way she looked, so still and focused, that made him realize how much he had come to care for her.
"Hey, Clara!" Hank called gently as he stepped onto the porch.
She turned toward him, her face softening as she saw him. "Hey, Hank," she replied with a small smile.
"How was the roof?"
"Good. Just finished it up. Should hold up for the winter." Hank sat down beside her on the porch, feeling the cool evening air on his skin.
How about you?
"How's everything going?"
Clara hesitated before answering. She looked out over the land again, her eyes distant. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, her voice quiet. "About everything. About who I was and who I want to be." Hank remained silent, letting her speak at her own pace. He could sense she was still grappling with the uncertainty that had followed her since she arrived here. But there was something different in the way she spoke now, more confident, more assured. "I don't remember much about my old life," Clara continued, "but I know I don't want to go back to it. It's like a fog, a part of me that's lost somewhere I can't reach. But I'm here now, and I'm not the same person I was before." "You're right," he said softly. "You're not the same. But I don't think any of us are. Not after everything we've been through." Clara looked at him, and for a moment their eyes locked. There was an unspoken understanding between them. Something that had been growing for weeks but had never been fully addressed. The space between them felt charged, as if they were standing on the edge of something they both feared and desired. "I've been thinking, too," Hank said, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "About us. About the future. You said it yourself. We don't have to follow through with what was promised. We can choose what comes next." Clara's heart beat faster at his words. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hank turned toward her, his gaze intense. "I mean that I'm not tied to that promise anymore. I've spent so much of my life trying to live up to my father's expectations, but I don't want to do that anymore."
I want to live my life on my terms, and that includes you, Clara.
Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had been waiting for him to say those words, to take that step toward her. But hearing it aloud was different. It felt real, solid, like something that could no longer be ignored. "I felt the same way," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I came here broken, lost. I thought I had no future, but now I'm not so sure. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do, but I know I don't want to be alone in it." Hank reached out and took her hand in his touch warm and reassuring. "You don't have to be alone, Clara. Not anymore." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time in a long time, Clara felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the peace she had expected to find when she arrived at the ranch. It was different, deeper, more rooted in the understanding that they both had the power to shape their own futures, together. The days that followed were filled with small moments that added up to something greater. Clara continued to work alongside Hank, helping with the daily chores around the ranch. She was becoming more comfortable in her new life, finding joy in the simple tasks she once would have considered mundane. She found comfort in the steady rhythm of ranch life, and as the days passed, the weight of her past seemed to grow lighter. Yet, as much as things had improved, there were still challenges ahead. The bandits who had attacked her family were still out there, and Hank knew it wouldn't be long before they returned, either looking for revenge or trying to finish what they had started. He had heard rumors of trouble in nearby towns, whispers of lawlessness and unrest. He knew that the peaceful life he had worked so hard to build could be threatened in an instant. One afternoon, as they were walking to the barn, Hank's thoughts turned to the future again. "Clara," he said, his voice serious, "there's something I need to tell you." Clara turned to face him, concern flickering across her face. "What is it?" "I don't know what's coming," Hank said, his jaw set. "But I promise you this. Whatever happens, I'll protect you. I'll protect this ranch. And I'll protect what we've built here." Clara reached out and placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "You don't have to do this alone, Hank. We're in this together." Hank looked down at her hand on his arm, feeling the weight of her words. It was the first time they had truly acknowledged what had been growing between them. This quiet understanding, this partnership that went beyond the work they did on the ranch. They were in this together, not just as a man and a woman, but as equals, with shared goals and a shared future. The wind picked up, rustling the trees and sending the leaves scattering across the ground. Clara stood there beside Hank, her heart full, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew they would face them together. As the sun set behind them, casting a warm glow over the ranch, Clara and Hank stood side by side, the quiet promise of the future stretching out before them. They didn't have all the answers, and there were still many uncertainties ahead. But one thing was clear: they were no longer bound by the past. They had the freedom to choose their own path, and that was enough. The weeks passed, and the seasons began to change on the ranch. The days grew shorter, and the cold winds of winter started to sweep across the land. Hank and Clara had settled into a new rhythm of life, their days filled with work, quiet moments, and shared time together. Though their past still lingered in the corners of their minds, they had built something solid. A partnership born not out of obligation but of mutual respect and shared experience. They had become something more than strangers or promises made long ago. They had become friends, and slowly, that friendship had turned into something deeper. One evening, after a long day of work, Hank and Clara sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and orange. The wind was gentle, rustling the tall grasses that stretched out in front of the cabin. The peacefulness of the moment settled over them both like a comforting blanket. "You know," Clara said softly, breaking the silence, "I never thought I'd end up here. I never thought I'd find peace, or even a reason to keep going."
Hank glanced at her, his eyes thoughtful. "I don't think any of us ever know where life will take us."
But sometimes the path we end up on is the one we need. Clara smiled slightly, her gaze following the path of the setting sun. "I think I'm starting to believe that." The conversation lingered for a moment before Clara spoke again, her voice more serious. "What do you think the future holds for us, Hank? I mean, really, after everything that's happened." Hank didn't answer immediately. He sat back in his chair, looking out at the land he had worked so hard to build, the land that had been part of his family for generations. The future had always felt uncertain, something to be faced with hard work and perseverance. But now, with Clara by his side, that uncertainty seemed less daunting. "I don't know," Hank said honestly, his voice soft. "But what I do know is that whatever happens, I want to face it with you. We've both been through so much, and we've come out on the other side. We've built something here, Clara, something real." Clara turned to look at him, her heart fluttering slightly at his words. "You really mean that, don't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hank smiled, the warmth of it reaching his eyes. "I do." For a moment neither of them spoke. The quiet was comfortable, a reflection of the trust they had slowly built between them. But Clara could feel that there was more Hank wasn't saying. She had seen the way he looked at her sometimes, the way his gaze lingered, as if he was trying to decide something important. She didn't want to push him, but she couldn't help but wonder what was on his mind. "I think," Clara began carefully, "we've both spent so much time worrying about the past, about things we couldn't control. But maybe now it's time to stop worrying about what comes next and just live in the moment." Hank looked at her, his expression shifting. There was a hesitation in his eyes, but Clara could tell that it wasn't fear. It was something else, something deeper. "Maybe you're right," Hank said, his voice steady. "I've spent a long time trying to do things the way I thought they were supposed to be done. I followed the rules, did what was expected of me. But I'm starting to realize that the only way to move forward is to stop living for someone else's dream and start living for my own." Clara's heart warmed at his words. She had always been someone who believed in following her own path, even when it wasn't the easiest choice. It hadn't always been easy, but it had led her here, to this ranch, to Hank. And now, more than ever, she felt that they were both ready to move forward, together. "You're not alone in that," she said softly, her hand reaching out to touch his. "We don't have to be alone anymore, Hank. We don't have to carry all that weight by ourselves." Hank's gaze softened as he looked down at their joined hands. He had spent so many years carrying the weight of his father's expectations, and for the first time he felt like he could set that weight down. He didn't have to follow the path his father had laid out for him. He could make his own choices now, and with Clara beside him, those choices didn't seem as scary as they once had. The days continued to pass, and with each one, Hank and Clara's bond grew stronger. They worked together side by side, their connection deepening with every passing moment. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a shared respect and trust that had been built over time. They didn't need words to explain it. They just knew. It was a kind of bond that didn't need to be forced or rushed. It was something that had grown naturally, out of the shared experience of healing, of building something together. One afternoon as they were walking through the fields, Hank stopped for a moment and turned to Clara. There was a seriousness in his expression, something that made Clara's heart race a little faster. "Clara," Hank said, his voice low, "there's something I've been thinking about for a while. Something I've wanted to ask you." Clara's heart skipped a beat, and she looked at him, her breath catching in her chest. "What is it?"
I know we've both been through a lot.
We've both had to find our way, and it hasn't been easy. But I'm ready now, ready to make a choice. Clara's pulse quickened. She had no idea where this was going, but she could tell it was important. Hank had always been straightforward, and the way he was looking at her now made her stomach flutter with a mix of nerves and excitement. "I want to build a future with you, Clara," Hank said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I want us to be together, not just for now, but for the long haul. I want to stop wondering what might have been, and start living for what could be." Tears welled up in Clara's eyes at his words. She hadn't expected him to say this, but hearing it aloud filled her heart with a deep, overwhelming sense of love and joy. She had come to the ranch broken and lost, unsure of what the future held. But now, standing here with Hank, she knew that her future was here, with him.
I feel the same way, Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. I never thought I'd find someone who understood me like you do.
I never thought I'd find someone who made me feel like I could be myself. But you do, Hank. And I want that future with you, too. Hank's face softened, and he reached out, cupping her face in his hands. His thumbs gently wiped away the tears that had escaped her eyes. He smiled, his expression full of love and promise. "Then let's make it happen," Hank said softly. "Let's build that future together." In that moment, Clara felt a sense of peace and certainty she had never known before. She had found the life she had always dreamed of, not in the distant future, but right here, in this moment, with the man who had shown her what it meant to truly live. As they stood together hand in hand, the world around them seemed to fade away. The land, the ranch, everything that had once felt uncertain now felt like home. They didn't have all the answers, and there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time, they were ready to face whatever came next, together. The sun had set, and the stars above were beginning to shine brightly in the clear night sky. The quiet of the night wrapped around them like a blanket, and Hank and Clara stood there, their hearts full of hope, knowing that their future was just beginning. Whatever the world threw at them, they would face it side by side, and that was all they needed.